All right, everyone. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody, for coming out to this early session to kick off Drupal Camp Asheville 2026. So this morning we're going to be talking about how intelligence informed experience and how that creates new horizons for marketers. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Martin Anderson-Clutz. I am a senior product marketing manager specializing in Drupal. I work at Acquia, and I'm also on the Talking Drupal podcast. And if anybody wants to contact me, you can find me as ManClue on a variety of Drupal and social channels. Now, the reality is that for a lot of marketers, they actually see the growing adoption of AI as a threat because it is tremendously disruptive to a number of systems that they've used to sort of create success in a variety of online platforms that they've been using. So as an example, what we see is people increasingly going to LLMs, chat agents and those kinds of things, as opposed to search, which means, traditional forms of search engine marketing, paid ads, those kinds of things are not having the same kinds of effectiveness that they used to. In a similar way, they may have internal teams that are using AI tools to create content that doesn't always stay on brand. And then they may also see their websites becoming less stable because of the uptick in bot traffic. And so, there's a variety of different ways we can sort of quantify the impacts of these different trends for marketers specifically. But I think the key understanding here is that this is not some kind of, far off future that we're talking about, something that may come to pass, but this is something that certainly at Acquia we talk to customers who are already feeling these pain points on a daily basis. So even a couple of years ago, Imperva estimated that bot traffic had already exceeded human traffic for most websites. And so, you can see that the impact, is already being felt. We're building websites increasingly, not so much for humans anymore, but really to serve the bots that constitute the majority of the traffic. Google estimates that, 65% of searches now end without a single click. We call that, zero-click searches. And so from a brand standpoint, the fact that, most of the activity, within these search engines actually isn't driving traffic to the sites, whose content sometimes is actually the basis for the searches being performed, again, is definitely a huge source of concern for a variety of marketers. And so, a big part of that is the increasing use of AI summaries, in addition to sort of the chat engines. But you can see this impact of zero-click searches. So, over time, definitely a huge uptick in 2026. The organic click rate, increasingly falling. In the early months of 2026, below 30%, and certainly the trend is continuing to go down and down. And so, for organizations that use sort of search engine traffic as one of their barometers of success, this really is kind of a sea change in terms of, how they can, engage with their audience, but more importantly, how they can, report on the effectiveness of the kinds of things that they're doing. And when we think about sort of, this traditional idea of the 5 stages of a customer journey, where people start by sort of trying to understand, what are the different sort of, brands and products that may be a fit for the kinds of things they might be looking for, start to figure out how to weigh those different options against each other, eventually decide on one to purchase, then move through to retention and hopefully, turn them into brand advocates. For a while now, the reality has been that customers have been doing more and more of this research self-guided. So, it used to be, when they wanted to start understanding the different options, they might, go into a store or talk to a salesperson and those kinds of things. And so brands would have that ability to sort of, guide the decision-making, present their own sort of view of the market, those kinds of things very early on in this process. But as people more and more are sort of self-guided really up until the point of purchase, the opportunity for brands to sort of impact that or influence that decision-making has really been disappearing. What we're seeing more and more is that because people are often using AI agents, deep into this process, again, sometimes right up to the point of purchase, they don't even have the visibility in terms of traffic to their website. And so, all of this is happening increasingly in ways that are completely invisible to the brands that are trying to engage with these customers. And what we're seeing is that, the use of AI at every one of these different stages is continuing to grow. So this is not something that's going to be going away anytime soon. In fact, quite the opposite. And so, we can see that, 85% of AI users use it every week, almost half every day. And, the numbers, again, are continuing to increase. Even these are probably outdated as of today.
Hey, Mark,
yes.
That's a clarifying question.
Yes.
Are you talking specifically about consumer product marketing or B2B? Like, are you talking about specific, or is this like across all spectrum?
This is across all, yeah, for sure. I mean, there are obviously some nuances in terms of consumers versus B2B, but yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the bottom line is that the tactics that a lot of these organizations have been using to have success in their marketing, really for the last couple of decades, aren't effective in this new landscape. And so what we're seeing is there are some, solutions and technologies that try to sort of navigate this new AI moment by kind of bolting on AI capabilities to sort of, make things more efficient, allow people to, generate content faster and some of these kinds of things. But I really think what we need to do is ask a bigger question, which is, in an AI-first internet, what does a website actually need to be? So what we're seeing so far is that, a website is becoming a place where crawlers, more than people, actually come for content. It's where customers will come to experience the brand, so they'll collect their information through AI agents, but when they're ready to sort of make the transaction, it's where they'll go for sort of, validation that this is actually something that sort of aligns with their own sort of like identity and those kinds of things. What we're seeing is that a website increasingly is moving towards being the place where a conversion event will happen, but not necessarily the actual purchase. So we're already seeing like agentic commerce, where people are using AI agents to even complete the transaction, but the website can still be sort of the place where ultimately that transaction, happens through, different kinds of protocols like MCP that we'll talk about a little bit later. And also, a website is just one element of an increasingly interconnected stack. So for a long time, we've talked about like a website as part of a, interconnected set of technologies, but more and more with things like MCP, these are working together in much more granular ways. So for a website to be effective in this new landscape, it really needs to have three specific capabilities that we're going to talk about. So number one is being an agile content engine. Number two is being a robust experience layer. And number three is being agent friendly. So in terms of being an agile content engine, we need to think, broader than sort of the traditional role of a CMS as a place where teams will go in to sort of draft, review, and then publish content. Because upstream from that, there's work that needs to be done around sort of like planning content, understanding where are the opportunities in terms of like content that could fill a hole in the market in terms of, things that customers might be looking for, answers that they're searching for. We need to then be able to use that to sort of ideate on the content. And the problem is that, using some of the traditional tools, the research can be slow and manual. They may be relying on outdated reports because, again, the landscape is changing so fast. And then there can be guesswork around sort of like, where are things going? And so all of that creates challenges in terms of, brands being kind of slow to market. Ooh. In terms of, sort of that part where we're drafting, reviewing, and publishing content, what we see is that, again, using sort of the more traditional processes, writers are starting from scratch, spending hours on things like research. They may be, relying on colleagues to sort of proof for grammar, style, SEO, and compliance, which makes the process slow. And then there can be bottlenecks if they're relying on sort of colleagues that could be, out of office or, busy with other tasks as the ones who need to sort of, validate and ultimately publish the content. And so, that creates a high degree of manual effort that's required to sort of get that content published. And then after the content is published, typically what you're going to want to do is really sort of activate and optimize that content. And again, using traditional processes, you're going to have sort of static schedules and limited targeting, as well as sporadic iterations, and having to sort of manually research exactly where we think the opportunities are to better optimize those. And that really creates sort of limited ability to optimize the content fully. So when we start to think about how AI can change that entire approach, using CMS with AI allows us to accelerate the time to market, reduce the operational expenses, and then also optimize for conversions to really drive much better results. Also, we need to think about a CMS or a website as something that can share content everywhere. So we've been talking about omnichannel for a while, but particularly in this new landscape, anything that works with structured content gives you an advantage because you can provide content in other formats, so not just like HTML, but like JSON or Markdown or some of the other sort of more structured forms of content that are more easily ingested by things like AI crawlers. And then also to have API flexibility. So certainly, we've been talking about headless, where you want to be able to use like REST, JSON API, GraphQL, but it's an emerging field, and so we can expect that landscape is going to change over time in terms of the ways that different kinds of technologies need to consume the content. Now, in terms of the experience layer, we talked about the need for the website as a place where people are going to sort of want to experience the brand before they sort of make their final decision. Increasingly, what we see is that buyers are visiting a company's website to validate a purchase, oftentimes that they've already made before they arrive. And so the role of the website becomes not so much to convince them, but to really onboard them into the brand experience. So they're going to want unfettered access to things like, social proof or case studies, technical specs to make sure that it sort of lines up with their particular needs. And as we talked about, in the short term, they may be arriving to actually complete a transaction, but over time, we can probably expect that, they may be using AI tools to actually perform the transaction on their behalf as well. And so as we've talked about, in this sort of new zero-click journey, the role of a website is not so much to educate, but to actually onboard them. And so, as we start to think about how AI can work with the experience layer, there's a couple of different ways that we can talk about this. So one is this idea of being sort of like inside out, so having AI built into the interface that you use to manage content, and then being able to export those out to something like, as an example, a headless front end. But also the ability to use other kinds of AI tools. So, maybe your team, has a lot of expertise and skills built around Claude, and then being able to sort of seamlessly bring that into your CMS and then publish it from there. But importantly, you want to be able to, effectively manage things like context, so that, any content that's generated is always going to be sort of like on brand, have the right sort of voice and tone, those kinds of things, but not necessarily rely on sort of, having your content creators, create these gigantic prompts to be able to do those. And so, some of the things that the Drupal community is doing around the context control center can be extremely powerful that way. In terms of personalized experiences, then, it becomes probably more important than ever to make sure that, you're really targeted in terms of the kinds of, not just content, but experiences that you're creating. But the reality is that, even in 2026, if you're trying to sort of fully dynamically generate all of these experiences on the fly, that introduces a number of problems. So number one, there can be latency in terms of the time that's required to sort of generate these in real time, as well as, again, the potential for AI to sort of, hallucinate or do some things that could be unfortunate for sort of your brand identity. And so what I would say is probably the best practice, at least for now, is going to continue to be this idea of using AI to sort of create experiences that you can then sort of manually oversee and curate, and then use AI to help sort of segment people and then show them sort of that pre-vetted experience. And so, from a sort of performance and governance standpoint, that's going to give you the best bang for your buck. But that being said, and I'll just sort of run this quickly again, there is the opportunity in the process of creating these experiences to really leverage AI in a variety of ways to sort of help generate the hypotheses. Where are the places where we think we might be able to get an uptick? How can we structure the tests? Automatically generating different content variations, and then also diving deep into on-site behavior. So there are tools that can actually take, like hundreds of hours worth of session recordings and then analyze those and then sort of bubble up insights from those in just a few minutes. And so from a marketer standpoint, that allows you to get, much deeper insights really without a lot of manual effort. All right, so we did talk about this idea of being agent-friendly, and let's dive a little bit more into that. So, one of the things that I've been hearing more and more is this idea of APIs as the new UI, or even the other way that I've heard people put it is, your API documentation for agents is really sort of like your UX. So having a clean, well-documented API, but also APIs that sort of behave exactly as documented is really critical for agents, because oftentimes if they can't understand the way your API works, or when they try to run a test against it and it doesn't respond in ways that are consistent with the documentation, they may just move on and find a different solution. And so all these become really critical, in sort of this API or AI first internet. In terms of machine-readable context, as we've already talked about, being able to provide content in more structured ways that are easier to understand for AI will also help to reduce things like hallucinations. And then also there's this idea of emerging agent-to-agent protocols. So MCP is the big one that most people have been talking about lately, but as we go through, we'll talk about a couple of others as well. Skills are kind of the sort of, I guess you would say, have been having a moment this year in terms of really being the way that people talk about how you can sort of share capabilities. So, having those within your website as things that other tools can use and vice versa. And so, to be able to use these different skills, there are concepts of like recipes as sort of a skill that's reusable, it could be a structured procedure that allows an agent to sort of understand how to use multiple APIs to achieve, kind of a higher level goal. So instead of being just like, here's this tool and how it works, it's like, if you want to achieve this broader thing, here's a recipe on how to achieve that. This idea of having agent-ready design so that developers can sort of create APIs. Again, having those detailed error states, consistent schemas, and importantly, having sort of understandable explanations. So oftentimes, APIs have kind of been guilty of like just returning status code and sort of leaving up to whoever's designing the implementation to sort of like cross-reference that with documentation if it exists, to sort of figure out what that means, why it failed. But having APIs designed to provide better feedback, even as part of the response, is definitely much more important for sort of this AI first internet that we're in. And then for interoperability, not just MCP, but also this other standard, agent to agent, and also wanted to talk about another one that's also emerging called AG2P. So these are sort of three different standards. They're not really competing so much as there's almost, you can think of them as sort of like different layers of interaction. I'm not going to go into all of the technical detail of these and how they work together. But you can sort of think about A to A, agent to agent, as the collaboration boundary. So it's how agents sort of like decide how they're going to delegate different work, hand off to each other, those kinds of things. MCP is really a way for them to communicate to each other what are the different capabilities and how they can sort of like use some of the tools that are available through other services, and then AGTP as sort of more the like network level connection protocol that they can use to sort of communicate in a more efficient way. And so all of these three are sort of, again, kind of complementary in terms of how they would actually work together as well. So one of the things I wanted to touch on, again, so within the Drupal world, there's a lot of talk about MCP. There's been some significant work lately in terms of getting that working. There is some work around A2A, and AGTP is sort of like an emerging standard. So there's been a little bit of work, but the actual protocol has been formally proposed, but it's not even adopted yet. So it's one of those things that, as it sort of matures and gets adopted, I'm sure we'll see more uptake within the Drupal community as well. So how do we succeed in sort of, again, this sort of newer AI-first internet? So some of the attributes that you're going to want, the foundation of your website to have are to be LLM agnostic and agentic. So, not being locked into sort of a single provider, because certainly one of the things that we're seeing pretty consistently is that there's sort of like a constant horse race in terms of new models coming out. So, Fable 5 was the new hotness, and then, OpenAI 5.6 comes out, saw all these different things. And so it seems like week to week, always a new leader. And so not being locked into one means that you can always use whichever model is most appropriate. And I think the other thing to also emphasize is it's not always about being able to use sort of the newest or the most robust, but sometimes being able to use one that's better suited to the task you're doing. So that may be more expensive, less expensive, maybe faster, because there have been some people who have found that by using smaller models for less, better defined use cases means that they actually hallucinate less. And so in addition to being cheaper, it may actually provide a more reliable result. Certainly another thing to think about is something that's built around sort of an open source framework, particularly because that allows for things that are collaboration driven. So, again, within the Drupal community, we can see the power of having lots of different companies kind of working together, pooling their resources, achieving lots more together than any one of them would be able to individually. And then also being composable and orchestration friendly. So, being able to use sort of the exact pieces that you need as opposed to sort of being foisted, a very large complex solution, being able to pull in sort of the specific technology pieces that you need for any particular solution. And so, of course, it won't surprise anybody in the room that, I'm a big believer that Drupal is extremely well positioned to sort of meet this moment that we're in. Because it is, an open source solution, it's well suited to a variety of different kinds of applications. And, one of the things that we've been seeing is that Drupal, has made decisions over, kind of the life of its evolution that actually make it extremely well suited for this particular moment. So things like, working with structured content, things like having a really robust but flexible, governance layer so that you can give agents only the exact amount of capability that they need to be able to perform certain tasks, and you don't have to worry about like, oh, guess what? The AI agent, wiped out my database as well as all the backups, and so now our website is hosed. You can sort of like give it, permission to update specific entities instead. When you use a Drupal AI, you get sort of a variety of different AI agents out of the box that you can start to use. It works with dozens of different providers, and that number grows pretty much on a daily basis. There's been significant investment, within the community as part of this AI initiative. We've got sort of a dedicated team, and there's all kinds of websites, literally thousands using it in production today. So it's sort of, battle tested and ready. Some of the principles that the AI initiative has adopted as part of, all of this work are things like making sure that it's really focused on AI human collaboration. So instead of being focused on replacing people. There's really a focus on making sure that we keep that human in the loop, so that it can really sort of enhance the capabilities of human actors as opposed to, again, replacing them. A real focus on making sure that there's trustworthy governance. So, making sure that you can have things like data sovereignty, privacy, the ability to meet different kinds of regulatory requirements. And then, again, that open source flexibility, giving people, well-documented APIs so that, you can pull in, either existing parts of the growing AI ecosystem or even build new parts yourself as you need them. And then really, making it a hotbed for community innovation, because we have seen, again, significant work by the people directly involved, but also sort of that flourishing ecosystem of other people sort of coming up with new ideas in terms of how AI can further enhance Drupal as a solution. So the AI initiative, again, pulls together top contributors and strategists from, around Drupal's AI ecosystem. There are actually a couple of teams now of full-time contributors. One of the teams is more driven around sort of like innovation, and then another one really more around sort of making sure that we have like production-ready solutions. And then also there's a focus on making sure that, as there are maybe changes that are needed in Drupal core itself to be able to better support AI, that we're making those needs clear and making sure that those get adopted so that the entire AI initiative can now keep moving forward. So again, thinking back to these three capabilities: an agile content engine, the robust experience layer, and being agent friendly, we can see that Drupal really ticks all of these boxes, and it's continuing to grow in all of these areas. So that's the talk that I have for today, but definitely wanted to leave some time for questions, because certainly what I've seen so far here in Asheville is that there's lots of interest and discussion about AI. So open it up for questions. I've left everyone speechless.
I'll ask one here. You talked about the importance of APIs. Do we see evidence currently that agents are sophisticated enough to use APIs if they're available?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's probably also accurate to say that there are some APIs that agents, will sort of understand like out of the box, like without sort of additionally pointing them to specific resources to say, here's an API that I want to use. But again, particularly if it's a well-documented API, even if it doesn't sort of like respond right away, that it understands and can use that you can sort of point it to the documentation and say, this is the API I want to use. Here's what I want to achieve. And then start to do that sort of like reasoning with it in terms of like what does the code need to look like to actually leverage that. There's one in the corner.
Out of all of the kind of ongoing initiatives and upcoming things around the AI initiative in Drupal, what would you say you're the most excited about over the next 6 months or so?
That's a good question. I mean, I'll probably tap Matthew here to talk a little bit more about some of the other things that are happening. But certainly, I would say like the recent things that I've seen, what I've been most excited about is probably a lot of things that are happening around context management.
Yep.
Because the ability for a website to actually act as a bit of like a brand brain and sort of like understand not only like what are the different elements of sort of like the brand identity and like what are the right ways to talk about the brand, but then also to have enough like contextual sophistication to know like when do I need to understand like what fonts to use, and when is it more about like the technical parameters of how like material safety and data guidelines or whatever that MSDS stands for. And so, being able to sort of like contextually bring in potentially a very large pool of context, I think is a bit of a game changer in terms of like its ability to really do a lot of exciting things.
So you should look up the Context Control Center module. Play around with it. It's I don't think that it's in full release yet, but it should be by the time we get to DrupalCon Rotterdam. And like Martin was saying, it allows you to build in contextual intelligence around all kinds of things. So you could have like understanding of brand identity, understanding of brand tone and voice, understanding of regulatory guidelines, all kinds of stuff like that that feed into the site and proactively help you craft experiences for your users that follow all of these different rules. It's pretty remarkable what's happening. The other thing that I would say, which we're not talking enough about, is I believe that Drupal itself is becoming the best open source harness out there. So I think we need to stop thinking about Drupal specifically as a content management system. And I think we need to start thinking about it as an AI harness and how flexible a harness it is. It's less important what models you're using, because the harness itself, in every case, is doing 80% of the work. So I challenge people to start thinking about Drupal a little bit differently than we have.
I can add one more thing to what Matthew just said, which is another piece around the context control center that I've seen as a bit of a forward-looking concept, but not something that's implemented quite yet, is this idea of being able to set sort of goals or thresholds for different parts of the site. So to say on this page we want to have a click-through rate of 60%. And it'll actually be able to proactively go and look at the analytics, and then if it falls below that, sort of generate I see that it's below here. Here's a update to the page that I think should help, and so be able to actually automatically draft content, based on sort of data that you don't have to manually go and feed it. It can actually proactively go out and get that, and then measure that against benchmarks and those kinds of things. So again, some pretty cool stuff in the works. Yeah. Any other questions?
I'll ask another one.
All right.
So more and more, there's a layer between businesses and the customers, an agentic layer, and a lot of that, at least for the customer, kind of feels like a black box. They get answers.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about how that complicates reputation management, particularly if you have customers that are wanting to poison the knowledge base, so to speak, about maybe some of their competitors?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of, I feel like sort of, that whole AEO, GEO space is kind of exploding with solutions right now. There was a recent Adobe acquisition, I think, in the space. So there's a lot of work being done. Obviously, it's similar to the way search engines have pretty much always worked in terms of by design being kind of opaque about, how certain things are calculated and so on. But yeah, whereas search engines at least have tended to have a bit of a mechanism to say hey, this person is running paid campaigns that are sort of in violation of your rules or whatever. It's still a bit of a wild west in terms of the kinds of content people can deliberately feed into these kinds of LLMs, as you say, to sort of poison certain kinds of queries or things. So it's an interesting space right now. I don't know that I've heard of a lot of specific guidance, but certainly the tools, are quickly evolving in terms of at least giving people insights of how certain things tend to respond and so on.
But I would add that all LLMs, regardless of whether a poison pill has been introduced, are biased, and we need to be aware of the intrinsic bias that's in place based on the entity that has trained that model. There are some things that you can do internally, in terms of your own, like if you've got a chatbot, for example, that's doing RAG against your database, you can build in guidelines around how that data returns and what kind of data is returned. For example, if you go to Drupal.org/AI and look at the search demo that I put together on the Umami website, it's using the latest version of Claude Sonnet for its LLM. But if you ask it things like, I've got a high-grade light motor oil I'd like to turn into a vinaigrette, because of the guidelines and guardrails that I've put around the internal query. It will come back and say, yeah, you can't. I'm not going to help you with that. But if you'd like to have some recipes, some healthy recipes using peanut oil or canola, blah 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 blah, it'll proactively come back and give you suggestions that won't kill you and your family. But if those guardrails aren't there, there's a good chance that the LLM will hallucinate, because they always try to be helpful, right? Helpful in some cases to your detriment. So there are things that you can do internally at least. Yeah.
Great point. I think there was a question at the back.
Yeah, I was curious, I mean, analytics out of LLMs, like how are we able to track, brands being surfaced via LLM returns or click-throughs or anything like that?
So, I mean, a couple of us in the room work for Acquia, and we've partnered with Conductor as a bit of a leader in that space. I think SEMrush as well is sort of like, has some tooling. So yeah, there's like a variety of different ways to measure that. Some people are saying that their data is more reliable than I think it really is. I think there's some inherent randomness to of the way a lot of these tools work. So you should really sort of take them as more sort of like directional in terms of like what are the kinds of sites that are being surfaced, how do they answer certain questions, and sort of use that as like to inform how you should create content, as opposed to like, oh, we went from 3 to 4, so like like the sky is falling, right? Like I think you have to sort of take the data to some degree with a bit of a grain of salt. Yes.
So humans, I feel like we don't read, we skim, and then the AI summarizes, and so it takes in a lot. So it's almost like it wants more information.
Right.
And so how should marketers balance that with like what is actually visible on their website? Can there be a happy medium where the AI gets enough info, or like with some of these other MCP A2A, would there be like a separate sort of just like agentic markdown? Here's the actual information you need.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I'm not sure if you saw, there was a blog post that Dries did a few months back where he had actually deliberately on his blog made all of the content available in Markdown files as well as HTML, and then tried in a number of different ways to like make sure that agents could have visibility of those Markdown files. So one of them was, I think, in the robots.txt, making sure that those were indicated. He also, like at a certain point on the HTML pages, actually said, by the way, this, like had a link to the Markdown files. But even with all of those, most of the crawlers wouldn't even ingest them. But even when they did, they were like ingesting them in addition to the HTML. So it doesn't seem to be any appetite for the crawlers right now to sort of like exclusively use the better formats. Which, I mean, I wonder, I suppose it's probably they've seen what's happened in the SEO world of people like trying to use all of these like, like keyword stuffing strategies and different things, that maybe they're being hesitant about saying, give us information on a different protocol in a different structure that may be wildly different in terms of like what it says, because then people may get information out of an answer engine that has like no bearing or no resemblance to like what ends up being cited as the source. So like I think it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over time. It certainly feels like there should be an incentive for the companies that are training their models to use more efficient formats. It would save energy, probably allow them to train models faster, all of those good things. But it's probably still early on. I mean, so we'll have to see how that changes over time, I think.
I have to imagine if you ran the same experiment 6 months from now and a year from now, you get different results both times as well.
Yeah, definitely true.
One of the things are changing so fast, it's ridiculous.
One of the things we looked at too when Dries was working on that was the LLM file. I think it's .txt or .md, whatever it is. There's like modules you can install, like all kinds of documentation how to use it, and we were kind of curious, well, do the agents actually refer to this? Do the models actually refer to this? And so I pulled logs across our entire Acquia Cloud Next fleet for request that file across any website, and what we found was that basically none of the agents were referencing that file. So there were all these how-tos and why this is beneficial, yada yada. But at the end of the day, it's like it's a file on your website that isn't getting used. And I hope if we rerun that test in 6 or 12 months, that they'll start using it. But that's at the same time, I suppose that's probably kind of ripe for abuse as well. So that they may have to have some conversations about that. Do we really trust these files because they're steering us?
So at this point, right for the agent or the LLMs and also for your humans, and kind of just balance that. And what's visible is kind of that's the
Yeah, but it's there's a variety of different sort of like best practices around like think about trying to answer very specific questions in a succinct way. Don't necessarily target like broad questions that they're going to have like thousands of sources for, but like if there are more specific ones that may be harder to find answers for, then you're more likely to get citations for those kinds of things as well. If there are any other questions, there is one other thought that I wanted to leave people with. So in the marketing world, there's this idea, or there has been this idea for a long time that, when you're marketing baby products, you're the consumer, even though they're actually used on babies, the consumer that you're marketing to is actually the decision maker who is the parent, right? And so even though they're products for babies, you're marketing them to the parents. And what we're seeing for some people, at least the way they use AI agents today, is they're kind of offloading the decision making to the AI agent. And so in that realm, the actual consumer becomes the AI agent. And so it's sort of like an interesting world to start thinking about, like, the growing idea of the actual agent as being the customer that you need to market to. So just leave everybody on that sort of interesting thought. But with that,